Okay, good evening. Uh, Thank you for attending either in person or via Zoom, the second community workshop regarding the City of Placentia's 2021 Housing Element Update. My name is Joe Lambert. I am the Director of Development Services. And with us tonight is the city's housing element consultant, John Douglas, and he'll be actually doing the bulk of the presentation tonight. Before we get started, however, I would like to recognize our elected officials in attendance. We have Mayor Craig Green in attendance, Councilmember Ward Smith, along with city staff. And I did get a text from Councilmember Shader. I think she's walking in the door right now. So really the purpose of this workshop, again, this is the second of two. We have also given a similar presentation before the Planning Commission twice, and we'll be giving a similar presentation to City Council. And so we're going to go over really the basics of state housing element requirements, and we're going to go over what we need, what we're looking for from the community and stakeholder input. We're going to go over the different issues that the housing element is required to address, and the needs that it must include, and our strategies for compliance with state law to achieve a state certified housing element. And finally, we'll get to the rest of the process and the rest of the schedule. And with that, I'd like to invite up our consultant, Mr. John Douglas, and if we could have the next slide, please.
Thank you very much, Joe. It's good to be here in person with you. Those of you who have been to any of these previous meetings or watched them on media, it's going to sound real familiar to you. So feel free to, those of you watching at home, feel free to go get a sandwich or something while I'm talking. So what we're talking about here tonight is the housing element of the general plan. It's one of the mandated components of cities' general plans. City of Placentia went through a comprehensive update to its general plan just a few years ago. And so we might think of this housing element as being the final step of that 2019 general plan update. And you see on this screen the various other elements or topics that are covered in the general plan. One of the things that I want to emphasize about the general plan is that state law requires that all of the different elements of the general plan be consistent. So there be no conflicts from one element to the other. And so that's particularly relevant for the housing element, because the housing element is looking at land use and regulations and plans where housing can be built. And so there is a direct link with the land use element to the housing element. And that'll come up as we go forward through this process. Next slide, please. So there's a large body of state law, more than any of the other aspects or elements of general plans for the housing element. And the housing element has been a requirement in state law for a very long time. The total body of state law that governs housing elements, I think it's more than all of the other elements combined. Thank you. One of the differences between the housing element and other elements of the general plan is the schedule requirement. So state law requires that cities go through this update process every 8 years. There are some other elements that have a mandated schedule by the state, but many of them typically don't get updated more than about once every 20 years or so. So the state legislature has declared that housing is a matter of statewide importance. And so that is why that they require cities to go through this process on a more frequent basis. So this update cycle that we're working on right now looks out 8 years into the future to the year 2029, and we refer to it as the 6th housing element cycle. And that's because going back to 1980, when state housing law was overhauled on a comprehensive basis, that's when these cycles began. And so we're now in the 6th mandated update of the housing element since that major overhaul of state law back in 1980. Next slide. There are a number of guiding principles established in state law as cities go through the housing element process. The first is to maintain and improve the existing housing supply, because if we look out 8 years into the future, most of the housing that we're going to have in Placentia 8 years from now is already on the ground today. There is going to be new housing, of course, but most of it is already here and with us. So it's really important for the city to try to encourage the maintenance and the preservation of the housing that we have. So that's an important theme in housing elements. At the same time, the need for additional housing continues in California and in vibrant economic areas like Orange County. And so one of the main requirements of the housing element is to look 8 years into the future for how much housing the city is going to need over that time period. State law also requires cities to plan for a wide variety of housing for all different economic segments of the community. We're also required to look at housing for persons with special needs. And that phrase, special needs, refers to people with disabilities, people who may be at risk of homelessness, or they may be homeless already. And there's a number of other categories that I'll talk a little bit more about in just a second that we're required to address as part of the housing element. Cities have a lot of regulatory authority when it comes to development and housing. And so as part of this housing element update, we're required to look at the city's plans and regulations and evaluate those as potential constraints on the development of housing. And those include things like not only the general plan, but also zoning regulations, development standards, height limits, parking, setbacks, all of those things that regulate how and where housing is built. And we're required to look at those to make sure that they are reasonable and they don't unduly constrain the production of housing, and particularly affordable housing. The topic of fair housing has taken on much more importance with this sixth planning cycle than it ever has in the past, because there is a new law that went into effect just this year that requires cities to examine the issue of fair housing and to use their municipal powers to affirmatively further fair housing in the community. So that's going to be a new topic that was in previous housing elements, but not to the extent that it will be going forward. And of course, what we're doing tonight, public participation. The state legislature has required cities to do a proactive public outreach process as they go through this housing element update to ensure that all of the different interests in the community, all of the different economic segments, different groups, different persons with special needs are represented and participate in this process. Next slide. So before we go any further, I want to pause for a minute and define what we mean when we say affordable housing. That phrase, affordable housing, is specifically defined in state and federal law. And there are 5 different income categories that we're required to address as part of the housing element. And they range at the lowest category is called the extremely low category. We have the very low category, low, moderate, and above moderate. And all of these categories are defined based on a percentage of the countywide median income. So all of the cities in Orange County use this same chart because it's based on Orange County's median income. State law says that families should not have to pay more than 30% of their gross income towards housing. And if a family needs to pay more than 30%, that is defined as having to overpay or being cost burdened for housing. And so that middle column there that says income limits, those are the upper end of the annual income that correspond to these different income categories. So for example, if you hear me use the term low income housing or a low income family, I'm talking about a family in Orange County who makes up to about $107,000 a year for a family of 4. I don't know about you, but that's kind of eye opener for me. 107,000 is low income in Orange County. We can also translate those income categories and income levels into what's considered affordable rent or purchase price. So again, 30% is that definition in state law that families should not be expected to pay more than 30% of their gross income. So if we take the hypothetical low-income family of 4 in Orange County, by definition, if an apartment costs no more than $2,689 a month, including utilities, then that is by definition an affordable low-income apartment. And you can see for the different income categories, those income limits translate into different prices in terms of monthly rent. Now, we can also estimate the for sale price of housing in these different income levels, but it's much more difficult to do because there's more variables in the equation. Those of you who have bought a house, you know, you've got the interest rate, you've got your property taxes, you've got your insurance, you've got homeowners dues, you've got maybe special assessments and so forth. So there's a variety of factors, and some of those things fluctuate over time, like interest rates, for example. So it's really difficult to pin down a precise estimate of the affordable price. So I've got some assumptions on the bottom of this chart that you'll see in the printed materials. And I've just used what is kind of the prevailing typical situation these days. And I came up with an estimate of around $500,000 as being an affordable purchase price for a condo in Orange County. I have not estimated a purchase price that's affordable at the lower levels, because when we have affordable housing that is what we call deed restricted, it is subsidized affordable housing, it's usually done at the moderate income level. And so it's too hard to make affordable housing pencil out at those lower income categories. Okay, so that's the purpose of this, just to define when we say affordable housing and we say low income family, this is what we're talking about. Let's go to the next slide. So as we go through this housing element update process, there are a couple of topics that kind of rise to the top that are the most important in terms of addressing the requirements of state law. The first of these has to do with reviewing the city's regulations to make sure that the city's zoning and standards and other code requirements are consistent with what state law has established. And the state legislature has established a wide range of requirements that control what cities have to do when it comes to housing. And that's been in spades the last few years as the legislature has been producing a huge volume of housing legislation, as you know. So that's one of the main requirements, is we're going to be looking at the city's plans and regulations with an eye towards what the state requirements are to see if there's any inconsistencies there. And I can give you a kind of a preview. There are some inconsistencies today because there have been some new laws that have just gone into effect within the last couple of years. So that will be one of the things that comes out of this housing element process, is updating some of the city regulations to bring them into conformance with current state law. The second big issue that's received a huge amount of debate, discussion, argument over the last couple of years, and that's the RHNA, the Regional Housing Needs Assessment. In a nutshell, state law says California needs more housing, and it's the obligation of every city and county to play a role in trying to address the need for more housing. And so the way the process works is at the beginning of each cycle, the state assigns a total housing need for our region. We're here in Orange County, which is part of the SCAG region, Southern California Association of Governments. And the SCAG region covers 6 counties of Southern California, not counting San Diego, because San Diego is a separate region. So Orange, LA, Riverside, San Bernardino, Ventura, Imperial counties. Those are the 6 counties of the SCAG region. So the process begins and the state assigns to SCAG a big number. And I'll show you in just a second what that number is. And then SCAG is responsible for allocating that total regional need to each of the different jurisdictions within the SCAG region. And there's about 200 different jurisdictions in the SCAG region. I'll come back and talk a little bit more about that in just a second. The third issue is affirmatively furthering fair housing, which is, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, it's taken on much more importance. The issue of fair housing has always been important, but it's of heightened importance because of a new law, Assembly Bill 686, that was passed just not too long ago. So the AFFH requirements that we're required to look at in the housing element include public outreach to survey the community, to gain information and insight about what the fair housing needs are, an assessment of fair housing needs, an analysis of the sites where new housing can be built, with an eye towards whether the areas that are zoned for housing create opportunities that further the objectives of fair housing. And then finally, for the housing element, to include policies and programs to address any issues that have come out of the process, any problems of a fair housing nature. So those are sort of the 3 big issues in my mind as we go through this housing element process. Let's go to the next slide. So I've mentioned housing for persons with special needs a couple of times, and what I mean by special needs and what state law means by special needs is the groups that you see on the left side of this chart. So specifically called out in state law, the legislature has said the elderly, persons with disabilities, large families, 5 or more people in the family, people who are homeless, female-headed households, or more generally, single-parent households, farm workers, and people who are of extremely low income. And a couple slides back, remember that top row on the chart was extremely low income. So those are the different categories of special needs that we are required to look at as we go through this housing element update process. We're required to look at those with an eye towards what their housing needs are and how those housing needs can be addressed. What the city can do in order to further the production of housing for those categories of special needs. So over on the right, we see there's a variety of different types of housing that state law requires cities to address as part of their development and zoning regulations. So accessible housing, that's people with disabilities. Maybe they need a wheelchair ramp or grab bars and things like that. Those have been in the building codes for a very long time. So every year, or not every year, typically every 3 years, the city updates its building codes consistent with the state updating the building codes. And so cities typically just adopt the statewide building codes, and it addresses the issue of accessible housing. Residential care facilities, group homes, folks with a disability are considered a protected class under state and federal law. And so the state legislature and the housing element process takes persons with disabilities very seriously. So cities are required to accommodate residential care facilities in their zoning regulations. Transitional housing and supportive housing are types of housing that are designed for people who may be at risk of homelessness, but for that housing, they might be on the streets. Supportive housing is particularly tailored to people with disabilities who need some sort of care along with the housing. And so when we talk about supportive housing, it might have some staff on the premises that helps people keep track of their medications, maybe job counseling, maybe coordinating transportation, maybe they need a shuttle bus and that sort of thing. So supportive housing would be housing plus services. Emergency shelters. And there's a new type of facility called a navigation center. And here in Placentia, we know about those. There's a new state law that requires cities to include in their zoning regulations both emergency shelters and low barrier navigation centers to allow those to be built under fairly minimal types of regulations. Affordable workforce housing is a huge issue. We saw a couple slides back, $107,000 a year is considered low income in Orange County for a family of four. But families who have even higher incomes, $150,000 a year, they have trouble buying a house. If they have kids, the bills just, it's mind boggling. So when we talk about affordable workforce housing, we're talking about housing that might be much higher than the $500,000 I showed as affordable for moderate, but still people with two good jobs have trouble affording housing in places like Orange County these days. Employee housing is more relevant to places like the Inland Empire and the Central Valley because that's talking about farm worker housing. 50 years ago, there was a lot of agriculture in Orange County, not so much anymore, except down in the far south parts. But in many parts of the state, agricultural and farm worker housing is a really important issue. I do some work up in Ventura County, and farm worker housing is huge in Ventura County. So that's called out in state law as a category of special needs. And then probably one of the topics that's gotten as much discussion as anything in the last couple of years, ADUs, accessory dwelling units. The state legislature has passed a number of laws in the last few years to relax the standards and encourage the production of accessory dwelling units. So these are all the different categories of special needs and special needs housing that we're required to look at as we do the housing element and make sure that the city's regulations are consistent with state law and that they encourage all of these different types of housing. Let's go to the next slide. And we'll talk about the RHNA. The Regional Housing Needs Assessment has been a requirement since 1980 when the housing element law was completely overhauled and expanded. And as I mentioned a few minutes ago, it's basically the requirement that every city in the state has an obligation to try to help address the need for more housing that is needed. The state legislature says we have a housing crisis. And so all of these laws that we've been seeing the last few years are driven by that issue that we are in a crisis situation with regard to housing in California. So at the beginning of the process, the state assigns our region a total housing need number. SCAG then goes through a year and a half long process where they develop a methodology for dividing that need to the different jurisdictions. And each county and city is assigned a share of that need. And then that assigned RHNA number becomes the city's obligation that becomes a key part of their housing element. And they have to analyze their capacity to see if there's enough land with the right zoning such that the amount of housing in the assigned RHNA could be met. Doesn't have to be met, but it could be met. And the RHNA allocation is divided into those different income categories that I showed a few slides ago. So let's go to the next slide and we'll take a look at some the two different requirements. They're related, but they're different. So in state law, RHNA law says that the city has to make sure that it has plans and zoning regulations so that the amount of housing assigned through the RHNA could be built. Now I say could, not must. It could be built because cities don't have full control over the development process, right? I mean, cities adopt plans, they adopt zoning. In some cases, they may enter into partnerships or agreements with developers to try to encourage housing to be built. But most housing is built by the private sector, and the city's role in it is to review the plans, approve the plans, and inspect the product and make sure that it's safe. And that's, so the city has a limited amount of control over the situation. That's why the RHNA requirement in state law doesn't mandate that cities actually achieve those numbers. It's because cities don't have the ability to go out and build housing. What cities must do is make sure that they have what's called adequate sites where the housing could be built. Sometimes people will say the city sets the table for development. By setting the table, we mean adopting the plans, adopting the regulations. Here in Placentia, the recent changes to zoning regulations for the TOD, transit-oriented development areas, and the Old Town areas to encourage and allow more housing. Those are examples of critical steps in this process of creating adequate sites. On the other side of the coin is the actual production, and the RHNA numbers are used as a yardstick for measuring how cities are doing in terms of housing production. It's not a mandate, but there's law that's been passed that says if cities are not achieving their RHNA numbers, then under some circumstances, they are required to expedite and simplify the review process for certain kinds of housing projects. And those certain kinds of housing projects are housing projects that include affordable housing, and they use prevailing wage labor, which is union scale labor. In Orange County, typically market rate production housing does not use prevailing wage labor, but affordable housing that's getting subsidies from some governmental source is required to use union scale labor. So to summarize again on this production, every year, and sometimes you may see a newspaper article that uses the report card system where, you know, such and such a city is given a C or a D in terms of its production of housing. What that means is the city has a RHNA number that it's been assigned, and then on the other side is, okay, what did you actually produce? And cities are required to look at that. And if there's a shortfall, they're expected to look at that and see, okay, why aren't we achieving what we were assigned? Probably the simplest and the most relevant answer as to why cities don't achieve their RHNA numbers is that it takes a huge amount of money to subsidize affordable housing. And when I say huge amount, I've seen numbers anywhere from $200,000 per unit on up to, believe it or not, close to $1 million per unit of public subsidy in order to produce a low-income housing unit. And it doesn't take long to, you know, the old joke, you know, $1 billion here and $1 billion there, pretty soon you're talking about real money, right? So that's one of the reasons why cities are not penalized if they don't achieve their RHNA numbers, because it takes a huge amount of money, and it takes more money to achieve the RHNA numbers than is available. So you might say that the system is sort of set up to fail, you know, from the get-go. But the state law still expects cities to do what they can to try to achieve those numbers. Okay, let's go and look at the actual numbers. So for this 8-year period out to 2029, at the beginning of this process, a couple of years ago, the state assigned our region over 1.3 million housing units as our share of the statewide need. To put that into context, 8 years ago, when we were going through this exercise, that number was about 490,000 units, if my memory serves. So it's like 2.5 times what it was 8 years ago. Orange County's share of the region is 180, almost 184,000 units, and Placentia's share, 4,374 units. To put that into context, I had the pleasure of working with Placentia 8 years ago when we went through this process. 8 years ago, Placentia's assigned share was about 400 units. Yeah, in the range between 400 and 500 units. And the time before that, it was 100 units. So in the 3 housing element cycles, 2 times ago, it was 100 units. Last time it was 400 and something. This time it's 4,000 and something. So that's sort of, that's a steep hill to climb, to put it mildly. Let's go to the next slide. So that total, the 4,300, is divided into the income categories that we talked about before on the affordability chart. And they're distributed at these different income levels. So what these affordability numbers translate into different types of housing. So you have apartments, condos, single family houses. Those different types of housing typically have different costs, right? I mean, apartments are typically less expensive than a single family house. And so as we're going through this analysis of our zoning and our sites, we're looking at these affordability numbers through the lens of what type of housing would satisfy that need. And state law actually specifies what type of housing would satisfy the very low and the low income numbers. And they use density as the proxy for how you decide whether the zoning is appropriate for those income categories. So at the very low and the low income level, state law says for most of the cities in Southern California, you need a density of at least 30 units per acre in order to make it feasible for apartments or condos to be built at the low or very low level. At the moderate income level, it can be lower density than that. You might have townhouse type development that might be 2-story with tuck under garages, 15, 18, 20 units per acre, something like that. And then single family houses or larger condos are going to be in the above moderate category. So as we go through this analysis, we're looking at the different types of zoning that the city has and the sites that are available for housing and what the density is allowed on those sites and what income categories those sites would be expected to accommodate. And that's what we call the sites analysis. And we do that exercise at a parcel specific level, and then we compare that to the RHNA numbers. Now, where the joke where the rubber meets the road is if cities go through this exercise and they conclude that there are not enough sites where housing can be built today based on our current plans and regulations, state law says, okay, you are expected to proactively address that problem. And the way that that's done is by amending plans and amending zoning regulations in order to stimulate and allow the production of more housing so that it's possible to achieve those RHNA numbers. So we're in the final stages of analyzing our sites inventory. And within the next few weeks, we're going to have a draft housing element document available for public review that's going to have parcel by parcel where the properties are where additional housing can be built. And then we'll compare that to these RHNA numbers. Let's go to the next slide. So to wrap up here, before I turn it back over to Mr. Lambert, to summarize the RHNA, it's a planning target. It's not a mandate or a quota. And I mentioned a minute ago why it's not a mandate or a quota, because cities don't have full control over the development process. What cities are required to do is demonstrate that their inventory of sites based on plans and zoning can accommodate the amount of RHNA that's been assigned to them. And we demonstrate that by a parcel by parcel analysis of how much housing could be built on which parcels. The two lower income categories, that is the very low and the low, can only be satisfied in that analysis if the zoning allows 30 units per acre density. It can be multifamily, it can be mixed use. It could also be accessory dwelling units. Now, ADUs don't have a density associated with them, but the state allows us to project forward how many ADUs we think we're going to get over the next 8 years. Just for those of you who are not developers or architects, just to put into context what we're talking about with densities. Now, the TOD area, Joe, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the allowable density is in like 60 to 90 units per acre range. So 30 is quite a bit lower than what we already have in the TOD and the Old Town areas. So I think the new project that is just wrapping up across from the future train station, that's at about what, 80 something units per acre? Yeah, and it's 5 or 6 stories tall. So 30 units per acre is typically about 3 stories. Okay, the other thing that's really important for property owners to keep in mind is that if a property shows up in the housing element as a potential site for housing, that does not require the property owner to build anything. There's no mandate that goes with being listed in the housing element, okay? And especially if the property is listed as a potential low-income housing property, does not mean that low-income housing has to be built on that property. It's simply the way the state has set up the rules so that if the zoning allows a high enough density, then it's assumed to be suitable for low-income housing. Okay, just want to make sure that that's clear. And then finally, the bottom line is if at the end of this process and we go through the exercise and looks like we don't have enough capacity, then we, the Planning Commission, the City Council are going to have to look at options for creating more capacity. So let's go to the next slide, see if that's my cue. Yeah, that's my cue. Thanks. I'm going to let Mr. Lambert talk about his local knowledge here.
Yes, so this slide is regarding a sites inventory. As John was stating, the TOD zone located on Crowther Avenue, pretty much between Kramer and the 57 freeway, does allow a density of 65 to 95 units per acre. And the developments that are under construction right now, the Herald is nearly complete. It's partially occupied, actually, is about, I think, 80 units per acre. And the JPI project is, I think, closer to 90 units per acre. And according to our rough calculations, the remainder of the TOD zone, or that stands for transit-oriented development, could accommodate 200 to 500 additional units. And the reason it's approximate like that is it is dependent on, there are other uses that are permitted in the TOD zone. So it's hard to say exactly if all of those permitted uses would be housing. We have a packing house in that area. We have other properties that could potentially be used for other uses. Right here at Old Town Placentia, where we are broadcasting from, is in a similar zone, in that back in 2017, the City Council adopted the Old Town Placentia zone and streetscape master plan and other associated documents. And those documents indicate that the Old Town area could accommodate up to 525 additional units. And there is a portion, a sub area of our Old Town area that's a high density area and already allows 60 to 65 units per acre by right, actually. So that type of zoning, as John was explaining, because it's 30 units per acre or more, it's automatically considered as an affordable housing site. Also, as we mentioned back in 2019, the general plan was comprehensively updated, including the land use element, at which that time the land use designation for many properties citywide was changed, especially in the area of Atwood, south of Orangethorpe, east of Jefferson Street, in which many acres of industrial or light industrial property was redesignated and then subsequently rezoned to R3, which allows 25 units per acre. We've already had some developments entitled in that area. And we're estimating, this is a rough estimate, that that area could accommodate probably another 500 additional units entitled. And then there's vacant land throughout the city. Many sites are small. There are larger sites. There is a relatively large vacant land site near Alta Vista and Rose, which is already designated. It's in a specific plan. It is designated residential as well. And then citywide infill on small parcels, accessory dwelling units, those are ADUs, et cetera. And as John mentioned, we are finalizing our sites inventory. So at this point, we don't know yet if land will need to be rezoned, and if so, how much acreage. And also that direction will be the purview of the city council as well. The draft housing element and final housing element, of course, will go through a hearing process at Planning Commission and subsequent at City Council. And once the final housing element is adopted, it would set the course for the next 8 years. It would give the city a timeline to complete any type of rezoning. And besides the zoning aspect, there's really the meat of the housing element, just like the rest of the general plan, are goals and policies to encourage the production of housing and especially affordable housing. Next slide, please. And so these are the next steps. You can see here, we're at September 16th. This is our second community workshop. We are planning to give essentially this same presentation at City Council next Tuesday. And we are tentatively scheduling a late September Planning Commission review of a draft housing element, and also tentatively an October 5th City Council review of that same draft housing element, assuming we can meet our deadlines. If not, these dates would have to be updated slightly. Once council adopts a draft, we would send it up to the State Housing and Community Development Department, or HCD, for their review. And John and myself will consult with the state. That is really the standard process. Every housing element is assigned a reviewer at the state, and it's our job to answer their questions and make revisions as they see fit, and then take those back to our approval bodies, Planning Commission and City Council, for final consideration. And again, it is the City Council that would conduct a public hearing and adopt the document at the end of the day. And then as we mentioned, this is the 6th cycle, and these cycles are generally 8-year cycles. And so then we monitor the progress of the goals we laid out for ourselves in the housing element for the next 8 years. And we conduct an annual report. It is due, I believe, in April of every year. And that report also goes to City Council as a receive and file item. And what that report does is 2 things. It physically reports the amount of units, affordable or otherwise, that were entitled or approved, either by Planning Commission or Council or by staff. That could mean a single house, a duplex, or it could be a 400-unit development. And then we also report the number of building permits issued for units in that time period, including accessory dwelling units. Then we report on those that were finished, meaning people actually moved in during that. How many units did people move into that calendar year, or how many units were completed? And then the rest of the reporting focuses on the pages and pages of goals and policies that the housing element has. Next slide, please. And really, this is the end of our presentation. We have, you can see on the screen here, the link to our dedicated housing element update webpage. You could also, we have a search function on our website. You could simply search housing element. It'll lead you there as well, or even do a Google search. On that webpage, we have a survey in English and Spanish, and we are actively seeking public participation through that survey as well. Whether you're a resident or not, you're welcome to take the survey. And we have a general information email, dsd@placentia.org, and the phone number is our department general line at City Hall. And so with that, I'd like to open it up with any questions or comments, either from our live audience, or if you're on Zoom, I'm assuming people would raise their hand. Okay.
Hello? Is that working?
Hello, we can.
Hi, sorry, I couldn't tell if I was connecting. I was hoping, this is Elizabeth Hansberg, and I was hoping that you might have some information about knowing that there is still capacity, particularly in the transit-oriented district. How much, or is there going to be any rezoning, or it looks like you have sufficient capacity with the zoning that you have? Just curious about what it might look like.
It's hard to say at this point. I think it's going to be relatively close, for lack of a better term. There are other options as well. Another option is that, for instance, our R3 zone allows 25 units per acre. Something Planning Commission and City Council may want to consider is allowing 30 units per acre in the R3 zone. That would do a couple things. That would increase the potential densities and potential number of units. Vacant R3 properties or underdeveloped R3 properties could yield. And it would also, you could also assume legitimately that new development in that zone would be affordable, because as John stated, the state has set 30 units per acre for suburban communities like Placentia as an affordable zoning. And I'm happy to follow up on that if you have any follow-up questions to that, or any other questions.
Gilad, you're unmuted.
Hey, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Awesome. Thanks you guys for putting this together and for staying late and putting on these workshops. It's really helpful. So first of all, thanks. Just the only question I had was, how would one see a copy of sort of the inventory list, the site inventory list?
Sorry, I didn't catch that. Can you repeat that? Or the
Oh,
last
sorry, I don't know, maybe my microphone's too far away. So one thing I was saying was thanks for putting this together. And the second thing I was saying was, how could a person get a copy of the site inventory list?
Oh, thank you. Sorry about that. I'm standing right next to the speaker, so it was a little hard. Got it. The sites inventory will be part of the draft element as it is produced and made public relatively shortly, within a few weeks is what we're anticipating. And so the draft housing element will have a sites inventory, just as if you look in our fifth cycle housing element that's in effect right now. The sites inventory is in there. And as we go through the planning commission and city council process, the draft element along with the sites inventory will be made available. It'll be on the website. And so we anticipate having that, I would say within 2 weeks.
Oh, can you still hear me?
Yes.
So you guys, so there's a workshop with city council or a presentation to city council next week. Is city council going to know what sites are on the inventory list when the presentation is done? When the
No.
when the presentation is presented?
No, it's essential, that workshop is essentially another venue to do this presentation or a very similar presentation. So we've done 2 community workshops with this format. We've done it at Planning Commission a couple times. And the goal is to, right now, what we're really doing is more informational and outreach. And so we plan to complete that at the council meeting before we get into really looking at the draft element.
Got it. Thanks, Joe.
Any other questions? We'd be happy to answer. Okay. I'd like to thank everybody very much for listening or your attendance. Oh, yes, sir.
Elizabeth, go
Can I
ahead.
ask one more? Okay, thanks. I just had one more question. So Gilad asked if there was going to be a sites inventory available at the city council meeting, and you had indicated no, that it wasn't, it was more of an outreach opportunity. Is there going to be a list of like policies and programs available for review at that meeting?
No, not yet. We're just not there yet. We don't have a housing element draft yet. And I know Elizabeth and others, if you've been active in watching our process so far, it has been mostly these type of presentations. And so I feel like, yeah, we're about to get into really the meat of the housing element pretty shortly here, but probably 2 to 3 weeks from now.
Okay, great. Thank you.
I would also like to mention that we have posted our August 24th workshop. We'll post tonight's video on the Housing Element Update webpage, where you can also find the surveys. That's true. That's a good point. Councilmember Shader reminded me that one of the most important aspects of our housing element survey is to include any comments as part of the public review process in creating our draft housing element.
Eileen, go ahead and unmute.
Yes. My question is, nothing has been mentioned regarding the mobile home, manufactured home communities that are in the city of Placentia. Do they come under consideration at all?
I'll let John speak on this as well. In my opinion, as staff, we don't have any plans to conduct any rezoning or increase or decrease the available mobile home park zoning. So to that extent, no. John, unless you want to add to that at all.
I would just add that mobile homes are an important part of the overall housing resource. And the purpose of these workshops is to gather concerns and suggestions. And if there's I'm not intimately familiar with the city's regulations on mobile homes. There are some state laws that apply to mobile homes. But if anybody in the community has a particular issue or recommendation related to mobile homes or anything else, then we want to hear about it in these workshops.
Yes, that, and you can give us that via the survey or, and even comments tonight.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Looks like that is the end of our questions. Thank you. So if there are no more questions, we are going to wrap up tonight's meeting. I'd like to thank everyone again for attending. Again, I did recognize Mayor Green, Councilmember Smith, and Councilmember Shader is here as well. City Administrator Damian Arula is also here. Thank you all for attending.